Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium to speak on Darwin's strange inversion of reasoning, Dr. Daniel Dennett.
Well, thanks for that nice introduction, Susan. You left out what I thought would perhaps be the most important thing. That is, I spent the first 6 years of my academic career here at UC Irvine. In fact, I had a real Rip Van Winkle experience driving in today. As I turned onto the campus drive to come up here in the cab, I remember the first time I ever turned on a campus drive. I'd taken this job never having visited the campus. There was no campus to visit. It was the first year of UCI, 1965. And my wife and I from the east had never been really west of the Hudson until then. And we had to stop, no lie, we had to stop while two cowboys on horses drove about 200 head of cattle across Campus Drive. And we thought we'd really come to the west after all. So now I can get lost within 100 yards or so of the house that we lived in for 5 years in Irvine. But a lot has changed. It's good to be back. I'm very pleased to be here indeed. Well, National Academy of Science. I'm not a scientist. I'm a philosopher. And philosophers have to live with a very important fact, and that is that some of the people that we philosophers have to take very seriously, and do gladly take very seriously, are not philosophers at all. They're scientists, or they're not philosophers. And here are 5 particularly important ones, perhaps the most important, or 5 of the 6 most important. I wonder how many of you can identify them. I'll give you just a moment, see if you can get them. The top row is easy. So we've got Newton, Einstein, Freud. Yeah, he's a scientist. Kurt Gödel. And then Alan Turing. But the number one philosopher who wasn't a philosopher is surely Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin is, as some of you know, my hero, and you might think, well, you can just sort of tell. But I don't know why you would say that, really. We don't even look much alike, but in any case, Darwin has, in my opinion, deservedly had, the most impact of any non-philosopher on philosophy, greater than Newton, greater than Einstein. His idea, the most important philosophical idea that any scientist ever had. And yet, even today, a lot of people do not like Darwin's idea at all. Somebody sent me this photograph. They swear it's unstaged. Taken in a bookstore. This is the fiction section. You see the origin of species down there on the right under fiction. It is not fiction. Well, why was Darwin's idea so great? For a very simple reason. It united the 2 most disparate parts of the universe that we have, the world of purposeless causation on the one hand, with the world of meaning. From physics to ethics and poetry, philosophy and art, morality, the whole human realm of meaning, the whole animal realm of meaning, united with the fundamentally meaningless world of physics, just atoms and the void, if you like. And Darwin, for the first time, puts them all into one unified perspective. Well, you might say not for the first time, because there was an earlier worldview which at least purported to do that. And that is famously shown in this Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo, and in the central panel we have the iconic archetypal image of what I call the trickle-down theory of creation, where God leans out and creates man in his own image. And this image is not just a great work of art. I think it encapsulates an idea which, oddly enough, may be older than our species. What I have in mind is this. The trickle-down theory of creation may have even been, in a certain sense, obvious to an early hominid, Homo habilis, the toolmaker, who may have had some dim appreciation of the idea that when you have creation, you have some big fancy thing making something much less fancy. You never see a horseshoe making a blacksmith. You never see a pot making a potter. It's always big, fancy, smart things making lesser things. That's the essence of the trickle-down theory of creation. And it's so obvious that the creationists can appeal to it in this charming page of propaganda that was sent to me by a student some years ago. Test 2. Do you know of any building that didn't have a builder? Yes, no. Do you know of any painting that didn't have a painter? Do you know of any car that didn't have a maker? If you answered yes for any of the above, give details. Ha! Take that. It's so obvious, isn't it, that you just never get this sort of creation of things without a fancy creator. And then along comes Darwin and just overthrows that. Now, 2009 is the 150th anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species. And it is a great read, actually. It's fun. It is a page-turner, very well-written book. You could read it just as literature. You learn a lot about a lot of plants and animals in the process, too. At the end of Chapter 4, we have this one paragraph. It's actually one long sentence. And right here, the whole idea is right in this sentence. So I thought I'd just draw your attention to it and see how it goes. And as the late, great Ernst Mayr used to say, and as Darwin himself said, it's one long argument. But the whole argument, as a sort of formal argument, is right in this passage, and I'm going to highlight it in yellow so that we can see this. So this is an argument which has some empirical support for it, and he mentions that in the parentheses, as it were. So here we go. If, during the long course of ages and under varying conditions of life, organic beings vary at all, there got to be differences, in the several parts of their organization, and I think that cannot be disputed, if there be, owing to the high geometric powers of increase of each species, that is to say they have lots of offspring, at some age, season, or year, a severe struggle for life, and this certainly cannot be disputed, then, considering the infinite complexity of the relations of all organic beings to each other and to their conditions of existence, causing an infinite diversity in structure, constitution, and habits to be advantageous to them, I think it would be most extraordinary fact if no variation ever had occurred useful to each being's own welfare, in the same way as so many variations have occurred useful to man. But here's the heart of it. Now, if variations useful to any organic being do occur, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life. And from the strong principle of inheritance, they will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized. This principle of preservation I have called, for the sake of brevity, natural selection. So there it is. If you really understand that idea, then you understand the heart, the core, the central idea of evolution by natural selection, right in Darwin's own words. Now, that's the bubble-up theory of creation, and it is indeed a complete revolution compared to the trickle-down theory. And this was recognized by people dimly at the time and with great admirable clarity by one of Darwin's early critics, whom I love to quote, one of my favorite passages in all of the Darwiniana. And that's by a man named Robert Mackenzie, who's not otherwise known, except for this review he wrote in a journal called the Athenaeum, which was sort of the New York Review of Books of its day in London. And here's what he had to say. Oh, well, I see I've got some slides out of order here. Okay. So now, why is Darwin's idea dangerous? I wrote a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Well, let me ask you a question. Supposing in the United Kingdom tomorrow they started driving on the right, would that be dangerous? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It would be, there would be lots of accidents, lots of collisions. But you know, in Sweden, in 1967 on a Sunday, the Swedes switched from driving on the left to driving on the right. It went very smoothly. There were almost no accidents. It wasn't dangerous at all. That's because they planned for it very carefully. They all went in unison, together. It was all carefully planned out. Now, if the Swedish Civil Service could have planned for the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, maybe it could have prevented the terrible collisions that we've had ever since from people who want to do things the old-fashioned way in their particular part of the country. It's when you get only some of the people driving on the right that we have the real problems. Now, here's this early critic that I was telling you about, and here's his passage. By the way, the capital letters in this passage were in the original. This is a man in high dudgeon. Here's what he says. In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance is the artificer, so that we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that, in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. This proposition will be found on careful examination to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who, by a strange inversion of reasoning, seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. That's it. That's right. That's exactly what Darwin is doing. And it is not so surprising that some people would be outraged and just view this as completely impossible to take seriously. Now, I want to illuminate Darwin's strange inversion tonight by talking about another strange inversion by another clever Englishman, and that's Alan Turing's strange inversion of reasoning. I want to show you a remarkable parallel. Here is a photograph of some computers before Turing. They wore dresses, most of them. They often had degrees in mathematics from universities. They were human beings. And they were called computers. That's what computers were before Turing. Turing as good as invented the computer, the electronic digital computer. Before Turing, this is what the computers were. In the old days, computers had to understand arithmetic. They had to appreciate the reasons. Turing recognized that this was not necessary. Now, let's compare. Here's Darwin. I've done it in caps following Mackenzie. In order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it's not requisite to know how to make it. Here's Turing. In order to be a perfect and beautiful computing machine, it is not requisite to know what arithmetic is. That's Turing's strange inversion of reasoning. Put them together. And in fact, they go together very well. They are, I would argue, essentially the same insight in two different media. There's a deep an important parallel and affinity. And I'm going to try to illustrate that a little bit as we go along. Now, many people, as you know, can't abide Darwin's strange inversion. Now, some of these are creationists. That's as good as by definition, but it turns out there are a lot of others, too. One of the reasons I wrote my book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, was that I discovered, over the years, that there were all these people, not religious particularly, a lot of them, no doubt, atheists even, people in academia, very intelligent people, who just didn't like evolutionary thinking at all. They were extremely uncomfortable with it. They found it repugnant in one way or another. And there's many people that can't abide Turing's strange inversion, too. And so I'm now calling them mind creationists. So in addition to the biosphere creationists, we have mind creationists. I'm going to point to a few. Now, these are very distinguished people. These are people in my field who are mind creationists. A few of them seem to be both. Thus, for instance, Jerry Fodor. My longtime nemesis, Jerry Fodor. For years I've been saying, almost teasing him, saying that he was a sort of closet creationist, and now he's really out of the closet. He has a piece called Against Darwinism in Mind and Language, and he published a bizarre article in the New York Review of Books called Why Pigs Can't Fly. And he's working on a book against adaptationism. And basically the line of that book is, he thinks he's a naturalist. And he says, evolution happened, but natural selection doesn't explain anything. And now here's another quote to show that he's also a mind creationist. I love this one. If, in short, there's a community of computers living in my head, there had also better be somebody who was in charge, and by God, it had better be me. This is somebody who just refuses to accept the prospect that my ego, my res cogitans, might actually be some sort of computational thing. In fact, in his latest book, just out, he is now calling himself a Cartesian. That's his new term of praise for the view that he defends. And people like me and Darwin and Alan Turing, he calls pragmatists. And it turns out that now he has decided that pragmatism is the single worst idea any philosopher ever had. So the gauntlet is laid down. But he's not the only one. Tom Nagel, just this last year, came out with a remarkable article in Philosophy and Public Affairs, basically extremely sympathetic to, of all things, the intelligent design movement. Really remarkable. I've had a long talk with Tom. I think I've partly convinced him that he was taken in, but that's another matter. And John Searle, Berkeley professor. Now, it's not so obvious that he's a mind creationist, except that I would maintain that his doctrine of so-called original intentionality is basically the idea of treating the mind as what I call a skyhook. Now, let me tell you what a skyhook is. This is, in my book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I made a distinction between cranes and skyhooks. I've already given you the image of up and down. We have the trickle-down theory of intelligence and the bottom-up, bubbling-up theory. So think of the work of intelligence as lifting in design space. We've got to get from very simple, dumb things to really brilliant, fancy, complicated things. That's a lot of hard work, a lot of R&D, a lot of research and development has to do that lifting. Now, some people think, for instance, the intelligent design movement thinks, that there are some wonderful designs that are just so wonderful that they could not be arrived at by bottom-up methods, by processes. And so they say there have to be, in effect, sky hooks, which you can just hang in the sky. They're miraculous top-down lifters that can just hang there and do the hard work somehow. Cranes do good lifting, but they have been put in position by non-miraculous processes. Now, let me show you what isn't a sky hook. Oh, well, another slide out of not in the order I expected. It can seem that some design is too wonderful to have evolved. It's irreducibly complex. It requires a top-down helping hand. That's the main thrust of the arguments of the intelligent design movement. What they're doing, of course, and this is exactly what you should do if you doubt Darwin, they're hunting for skyhooks. The search for irreducible complexity is the hunt for skyhooks. What's happened, if you look at the last 150 years since Darwin, is that skeptics hunting for skyhooks have again and again discovered cranes. They've found new and wonderful ways that evolution works, but they're not miraculous ways. So they're trying to do the right thing as a skeptic, and they're also helping us a lot because looking for skyhooks, they end up discovering new cranes. It's very useful. We can be very grateful to them for finding them. Now, when I talk about skyhooks, I don't mean this. Somebody sent me this picture the other day of a company that's using dirigible blimps and calling them skyhooks. Those aren't miraculous. They're pretty good, but of course they are non-miraculous lifters. No, this is a skyhook. This wonderful drawing appeared in Atlantic Monthly a few years ago, and it's particularly apt because that's the dome. That's Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, and building it at that time was an engineering marvel. Nobody had ever built anything like it before, and putting that lantern, as it's called, on top was a particularly stupefying feat of engineering. Nobody had thought it was even possible. He didn't, of course, use a skyhook. What he did was he invented a whole bunch of cranes. And in fact, those cranes revolutionized building practices, opened up a whole new part of design space that had never been usable before or traversable. So that's how cranes work. Now, what you find among people who are particularly, I think the most common line of skepticism about evolution that I run into is people who say, well, yeah, evolution can explain a bird, it can explain a nightingale. What it can't explain is an ode to a nightingale. Stop and think. Poems are wonderful, but more wonderful than birds? Oh, yes, evolution by natural selection can blindly design a bird, a living bird, but not a poem. Of course, there is a big difference between creating a poem and evolving a bird, and I want to talk about that. But I want to suggest that the way to understand that difference is to see that in the case of the poem, this is something which is made by cranes, acting on cranes, acting on cranes. We don't need any skyhooks. So what I want to do is to sketch the bubble up path. And it starts right at the bottom with little robots. One time I was interviewed in an Italian newspaper on my views on consciousness and the self, and the headline the next day was, this was in Italy, "Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot." Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots, which is exactly my view. And that was perfect. So that's been my motto ever since. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. Such as this one. This is just an artist's amusing sketch. Inside every one of the cells in your body, there are thousands or hundreds of thousands, I don't know, maybe millions of these little robots. They aren't alive. They're motor proteins. They aren't conscious. They don't have free will. They are just little machines, little nanotechnology machines. And they carry stuff around inside the cells, and without them we couldn't live. So we have got, oh, by the way, I was going to try to show this little video clip, but I'm not adept or larcenous enough to know how to download video clips from YouTube. So, this is simply a still from it. There's an absolutely stunning video that you can find if you Google motor protein video or something of this little kinesin trudging along, carrying a great big globe behind it. We're made of trillions of mindless little robots. Not a one of them knows who we are or cares. But, of course, we know. We are knowers. We care. That is the stunning gulf that we have to traverse if we're going to unify the world of meaning with the world of physics. How is this possible? How come? It's Darwin's idea that allows us to answer this question. Moving to one of the great moments in evolutionary history, I'm going to say a bit about the eukaryotic revolution. Now, this is roughly 2.5 billion years ago. At a time before that, there were just simple cells, prokaryotes. They were bacteria. They'd already had 1 billion years to evolve, so they were pretty fancy. But they were also tiny and, in some sense, rudimentary. And what happened about 2.5 billion years ago is that instead of just one cell just eating another, which is to say disassembling it and using the parts, it joined forces with the cell, taking advantage of all the design. I mean, after all, if you take something into you that is the product of 1 billion years of design work, there's a lot of design to throw away there or to use. If you eat it, you pretty well destroy the design. You may find some very valuable raw materials there for various things, but you're not availing yourself of all the design. What happened several billion years ago is that instead of just dismantling these parts, they joined forces and made a more complicated cell. So on the left, you have a prokaryote, the bacterial type cell. On the right, you have a eukaryote, which actually includes in it the descendants of earlier cells, like the mitochondria, which have their own DNA. That's how we know, in effect, that this happened. So, and every cell in your body, every human cell in your body, is a eukaryotic cell. It has both the nuclear DNA, that's your genome, and it has your mitochondrial DNA, and that's the DNA that's in your mitochondria, and that is really, in some sense, an ancient lineage independent of the nuclear DNA. So now we have these teams that are joining forces, the eukaryotic cells. They're more complex, they're more talented, they're more versatile. This versatility permitted a division of labor. They could become brain cells, blood cells, muscle cells, nerve cells. And that made multicellularity possible. So if it weren't for the eukaryotic revolution, we wouldn't have multicellular life forms. And essentially everything that you know of that's alive, everything live that you can see with the naked eye, is a multicellular eukaryote. This is the house made by a single-celled eukaryote. It's made by the amoeba, Difflugia. It doesn't have a nervous system. It's a single cell. It's a single eukaryotic cell. Now, I haven't gotten this very far from the initial motor protein. There are two kinds of sandcastles. On the left, the sandcastle made by an amoeba. On the right, sandcastles made by some interesting vertebrates. We still have a long way to go to get from the left to the right. Here's intermediate case. This is a caddisfly larva, obviously multicellular, and much more complicated, of course, than an amoeba, and capable of some pretty fancy building of its own. This is a food sieve made by a caddisfly larva. And I think you can just see immediately how it works. You put this, it's built in a stream. The water flows in the funnel at the top. It goes through it. The food that's in it is netted out, is sieved out, and this is how the caddisfly larva gets its nourishment. Extremely clever design. You might notice that it bears a certain striking resemblance to this lobster trap. Now, what's the same and what's different about them? Well, here's the difference. There are reasons for the arrangement of the parts in the caddisfly's sieve. There are reasons. It's stunningly well engineered. But they're not represented anywhere. They're not represented in the caddisfly's little brain. They're not represented by Mother Nature. But they are the reasons why the parts are the way they are. I call these reasons the free-floating rationales of evolution. They're the reasons things have the designs they have, even though those reasons aren't represented anywhere. They're just free-floating, never expressed until clever human beings figured them out and talked about them. I'm going to give you a nice example of a cuckoo chick. Now, cuckoos, as you know, are actually parasites. They don't make their own nests. When the cuckoo is ready to lay her egg, she finds a host nest where the hosts have already laid eggs. And when the hosts go off to feed, she darts down, lays her egg in that nest. Very often she'll push one of the host eggs out. That's just in case the hosts can count. And she never returns. And the hosts incubate and raise the chick. Now, the cuckoo chicks hatch before the other eggs do. And this is what the cuckoo chick does before it has flown. The very first thing it does, little featherless, scrawny, basically blind thing, it pushes and pushes and pushes, and it rolls the other eggs out in order to get the food for itself. Yeah, I'm going to show you. There's a little film clip of this. If I can just get my... There we go. We have some sound on this? Yeah.
Everything appears normal, but appearances can be deceiving. Something is not quite right. One chick has hatched way before the others, and it is ejecting the remaining eggs.
Ooh. Now, I think you can see it is manifest that there's reasons there. You know the reason why that's happening. But the little cuckoo chick doesn't have to know the reason. That's the beauty of it. The cuckoo chick is the beneficiary of that design, but doesn't have to understand the reason. I think we might be grateful that the cuckoo chick knows not what it does. But it does it, and it does it because it's been selected by natural selection to do it. Natural selection tracks reasons, creating things that have purposes. You cannot doubt that there's a purpose there. But they don't need to know them. The CIA has the famous need-to-know principle. You only give your agents what they absolutely need to know to do their job. Mother Nature follows the same principle, but for a different reason. It's not for security. It's because it's cheaper that way. So the need-to-know principle reigns in the biosphere. And this is one of the hardest things for a lot of people to understand about the bottom-up strange inversion of Darwin. They're always imputing more knowledge and comprehension in the organisms than is required. It's this sort of a habit, a top-down habit of thought, which is hard to break. So we attribute more understanding to the agent than need be. And the reason, perhaps, is that we just don't have a familiar one-word concept of semi-understood quasi-representations or hemi-semi-demi-understood pseudo-representations. And that is where Turing comes in, because that's just what Turing has provided us. The states of computation in computers are not so much understood. Well, they're sort of understood by the computer, enough to act on them. But the computer can do all kinds of things without really understanding what it's doing. And so can nature. But now I don't want to give you the idea that birds are just stupid. And so I want to show you a strikingly different kind of bird behavior. There's no sound with this, is it? Let's see, do I have to hit the... Yes, I do. This is a New Caledonian crow. It's got a piece of wire, and it's trying to get some food in a little basket out of the tube. And it just can't do it. Poke, poke, poke. Can't get the basket. Oh, my. What's it going to do? Well, it's got an idea. It sticks a piece of wire in a little hole or something, and it goes around and goes around and goes around. Pull, pull, pull. Bends the wire. Ah. Now, we're getting there. We haven't got to the top yet, but we can see that evolution can produce some pretty amazing birds. And it all gets mapped on this diagram. This is a diagram that's new to me. I was using an out-of-date tree of life, and I gave a talk on this subject the other day in British Columbia, and got a very much improved tree of life. This shows all the different divisions since the very beginning of life. There's some deep controversy about what happens in the very early days. But I just want to draw your attention to a few of the categories over here. We have the microsporidia. We have the animals. Here are the plants way up here. Land plants. Here's animals. Here's our friends, the amoebas. So we're pretty closely related to those amoebas. So, and the microsporidia, well, that's things like, mushrooms. So here's some close relatives. We share genes with, that's one of those difflugias there on the left, the one that makes the house. So these are your cousins. This leads some people to a view which I want to say something about. It's perfectly expressed in this brief passage by David Brooks in the New York Times, less than 2 years ago, talking about the age of Darwin. He says, according to this view, human beings, like all other creatures, are machines for passing along their genetic code. We are driven primarily by a desire to perpetuate ourselves and our species. This sentence that I've highlighted, I call the standard mistake. The standard mistake. It is not true. It is not an implication of Darwinism. It is not part of the age of Darwin. And that's, I suppose, the main thing I want to stress today, because it's one of the sources of anxiety and confusion and just error people thinking about evolution. We are very different from other animals. And as Darcy Thompson once said, everything is what it is because it got that way. One of my favorite maxims. How did we get that way? How did we get so different, for instance, from the chimpanzee, let alone the mushroom and the amoeba? It isn't just about genes. So let's look at how this might run. We've had about 3.5 billion years for the whole tree of life. Only 6 million years to evolve away from our common ancestor with the chimpanzees and the bonobos. So all the differences between us and the bonobos and the chimpanzees has to have accumulated in the last 6 million years. Of course, that means we're very similar to the bonobos and chimpanzees. Our genomes are practically identical, less than 2% difference. All those differences observable today must be due to R&D occurring in that interval, lifting in design space occurring in that interval. And always remember, there's been just as much lifting in design space for the chimpanzees in those 6 million years as us. We aren't the descendants of chimpanzees. We and chimpanzees are the descendants of a common ancestor. Now, moving right along, because I don't have much time. 3.5 billion, 6 million. Now we're down to 10,000 years ago. Human population. We've started domesticated animals. So we have some livestock. We have some pets. And at that point, 10,000 years ago, we represented, according to the calculations of Paul McCready, less than 1%, maybe 0.1% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass. That is to say, the animals. Close enough. Not the insects and the worms and not the fish in the sea. The animals on the land, according to his calculations, human beings plus their livestock and pets was less than 1%. What percent today, do you suppose? Rather more. Somebody hazard a guess? How much? 90. No, too much, huh? 7%? 2%. 98%. 98%. Now, most of that is cattle. You eaters of McDonald's. Most of that is cattle, but this is what we've done to our planet in 10,000 years, which is just an eye blink in evolutionary time. And, of course, it's Homo sapiens, it's our species that's done it. Here's what McCready says about it. It's very eloquent, I think. Over billions of years but although there are a few things I want to correct in it as I go along. Over billions of years on a unique sphere, chance has painted a thin covering of life. Complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. Suddenly, we humans, a recently arrived species, no longer very subject to the checks and balances inherent in nature, have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush. Indeed, we do. And the key, of course, is the technology and intelligence. That's what has made the difference in the last 10,000 years. Interesting to compare that explosion to the Cambrian explosion, which occurred about 530 million years ago, and it occurred over millions of years. It was still sudden by evolutionary standards. Over that period of time, you had this fantastic flourishing of all these different life forms. Steve Gould made these famous in his book, Wonderful Life, the tremendous diversification of body plans, the strange, weird creatures that grew up in that period. And it was a tremendously creative period. As I say, 530 million years ago, and it occurred over millions of years. The McCready explosion, if we may call it that, occurred over 10,000 years. That's only 500 generations. It cannot be about genes. It just can't. There hasn't been much gene change in the last 10,000 years. It's not just genes. In fact, it's due to a second information highway from parents to offspring. Now, if you want to read a good book about this, you want to read, say, Richardson and Boyd's recent book, Not by Genes Alone, which is a very careful and interesting look at this. Culture is transmitted more generally. There's two kinds of transmission. First, there's from parent to offspring. That's so-called vertical transmission. And that's just like gene transmission. You get your genes from your parents, and you get a lot of your know-how from your parents, too. We call that vertical transmission. But there's also oblique and horizontal transmission of culture. The things you pick up not from your parents, but from your friends' parents, the guy down the street, and all the rest of those folks. This is what leads to what Boyd and Richardson call rogue cultural variants. Rogue cultural variants are like genes that you don't get from your parents and that don't behave as well as they might otherwise. But there's another name for rogue cultural variants, and that is memes, which is the term that Richard Dawkins introduced in his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. Memes are analogous to genes or to viruses. What's a virus? It's really sort of a naked gene. It's just a string of nucleic acid with attitude. It isn't alive. It's just a big macromolecule, but it has the shape that makes it powerful, gives it a competence to insinuate itself into the copy machine of a living cell and to have it make copies of itself rather than the cell's own DNA. That's what a virus is. A meme is also a not alive thing. It's a data structure with attitude that gets itself copied. Not in a cell, in a brain. And then it gets transmitted. All right, so now I have to have a little skeptical interlude because I know that a lot of people just can't stand the idea of memes. And they are inclined, for instance, to say, what evidence is there that memes even exist? Okay, I have a question for you. How many of you believe that words exist? I mean, words, like the words on the screen and the words in your minds and in your mouths and so forth. Well, words are memes that can be pronounced. It's as simple as that. So, of course, memes exist. If you think words exist, then you know that memes exist because words are just the kind of memes that can be pronounced. There's other memes that can't be pronounced, like fashions, wearing your hat, baseball cap backwards, ways of dancing, ways of making arches, ways of making boats, and so forth. Here's my suggestion then. What we are is apes with infected brains. Our brains are invaded by these hordes of virtual machines designed by natural selection. And these virtual machines give us powers that give us the versatility to take organization up a level. You see the parallel with the eukaryotes. We take in all of this well-designed competence, all these little tools, these data structures. We didn't have to make them for ourselves, and it gives us more powers. We become more versatile. And then we can participate in larger structures, in organizations, in universities, and governments, and religions, and clubs, and unions, and armies, and all the rest. Our power depends on the culture that permits us to divide labor and share expertise. So, here are two different fruits on the tree of life. One is a spider web, and the other is a power web. Beaver dam, a Hoover dam. Bird's nest, ode to a nightingale. These are all artifacts made by animals. They're not all the same. The methods of construction are different, but they are all fruits of the tree of life. So now I have to say a bit about the delicate transition from bottom-up Darwinian R&D to top-down creative genius type R&D. because it seems just obvious that we human beings we are, on occasion, intelligent designers. We are the very model of an intelligent designer. We have engineers and artists and poets and composers and the like. Well, here's a nice saying by a former student of mine. You can't do much carpentry with your bare hands. You can't do much thinking with your bare brain. First, you have to furnish it with lots of thinking tools. Fortunately, there's lots of them lying around for you to pick up and acquire. Words are the preeminent thinking tools, but they're not the only ones. Where'd they all come from? Oh, a few of them were created by individual word creators. They were coined. The word meme is a good example. Richard Dawkins coined it. But probably that's the only word I've used all day that was coined by anybody. Most words aren't coined. They are the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of the descendants of words that have been around for tens of thousands of years. There have been thousands of languages. They're dying at a terrible rate. If you want to devote your life to a really interesting and important project, you might become the kind of field linguist that are running out and trying to save them before they die. Save them not for use in everyday activities, really, that's too late for that, but just preserve all of that design information for the future. It's part of our biodiversity. For years, historical linguists have been drawing trees of life of languages. Here are the Proto-Indo-European languages, the Finno-Ugric languages, the languages of China, the Proto-Mayan languages. I mentioned earlier that when we get down to the bacteria, it's hard to draw a tree of life because there's so much horizontal gene transfer. It's just, you can't really say who's the ancestor of whom. It's the genes themselves that are easier to track than the lineages of organisms that the genes inhabit. The same thing is true of words. Words move very easily between languages. Think of all the words of English which come from other languages. So it's easier to track individual words and look at their lineage than to look at languages, which get messy very quickly. So I'm suggesting that we consider words as tools, as intellectual tools, informational tools. Now, words are not just used in grammatical constructions. For instance, passwords, labels, imprecations. These are sort of standalone uses of words as tools. Well, what are they made of? What are words made of? Ink? Sound? Not really. They're made of technique. They're recipes for action. They're like Java applets. They are. Those are tools, too. What are Java applets made of? They're made of bits. They're made of information. They're made of design, and that's it. They're just design embodied in bits. And words are similarly, they're designed to do certain jobs. What's long division made of? There's a little applet for you. It's a technique you've got. What's it made of? It's a tool you've got. What's cost-benefit analysis made of? We have lots of thinking tools. They're not made of aluminum. They're virtual machines. They're made of information. And it's this technology that has remade our brains and that make our minds. That's what our minds are made of. Doug Hofstadter, a co-author with me on a book and a longtime friend, in one of his recent books, he has a toolkit. He lists just some examples of the tools in his toolkit. I think it's an amusing list. Think of how useful these tools are. Wild goose chases, tackiness, dirty tricks, sour grapes, elbow grease, feet of clay, loose cannons, crack pots, lip service, slam dunks, feedback. If you got these tools, you can think things you can't think without them, or you can think them much easier. This extends your mind to have all these tools in your kit. Who designed these treasures? Well, in a few cases, they're like the coiners of words. There's individual heroes of intelligent design from the past that we can cite. Shakespeare, Pythagoras, Plato, and the rest. But nobody designed language. Nobody designed tonal music. Nobody designed maps or invented money. Who uses these tools? Now, this is where it gets tricky. Jerry Fodor might say, well, it's sort of a Cartesian ego that I have there. Or John Searle might say, well, it's just a conscious mind with original intentionality, and it's a sort of skyhook. No. That's not the way the bubble-up theory runs. The bubble-up theory says what we get is an alliance of hemi-femi-demi understood quasi-representations. Your mind is a virtual machine made of smaller, simpler virtual machines. And it gets installed, and then it sort of takes over, and it guards the entrance, and it evaluates yet other virtual machines. No, I don't want to learn how to play this card game, because it will be a distractor, and so forth. Now, what am I doing on time? Well, Darwin, in that wonderful book that you should read this year, Origin of Species, he starts it off with a brilliant bit of pedagogy. He starts with, first, methodical selection. He draws attention to how plant and animal breeders have deliberately and with intention and foresight set out to improve the breed, to make stronger, faster horses, faster dogs, tastier beef cows, cattle, milk cows that give more milk, and so forth. That's methodical selection, and everybody knows how you do it. You look at the variation among the offspring, and you choose the ones that are best, and you let them mate, and so forth. Then, brilliant stroke, he draws our attention to what he calls, I'm very happy to say, unconscious selection. This is where people, during those thousands of years of domestication, they, without thinking about it, without trying, without any intention, they nevertheless favored some of the offspring over others. They discarded the runts. They sold off or killed and ate the less valuable animals. And over time, this led to a very serious trend. The change, the design improvement happens whether you mean it or not, whether you're intending or not. So you have unconscious selection. Then he says, and then we can eliminate the middleman altogether, and we can have just plain natural selection, where it's just the vicissitude of natures that do the selection. So that, I call that Darwin's trio. Today, of course, we'd have to add a fourth way of getting this process to happen, and that's genetic engineering, which is really just a sped-up form of methodical selection. And actually, all four of them are still versions of natural selection. It's just natural selection where the main selective force is one of the species, namely Homo sapiens. We can do the same thing with memes. There's the natural selection of what you might call synanthropic memes. Now, synanthropic animals are things like pigeons, rats, squirrels, barn swallows. These are animals that live with people, synanthropos, with human beings. But they're not domesticated, and they are designed not by human choice, but by natural selection unaided. And they have to fend for themselves. Nobody's looking out for them but themselves. They have to be wily. Same thing is true of memes. The original memes, they have to be infectious, they have to be catchy, they have to be unforgettable, because they have to fend for themselves without any particular human help. Then we have unconscious selection, where that tune you can't get out of your head, but you revise it without even realizing it a little bit. Now you really can't get it out of your head, and then you spread it to your neighbor. The Germans have a nice word for tunes like that. They call them earworms. And they get stuck in your head, and they just keep replicating and replicating in your head, and then you spew them out into the world, and then they replicate in somebody else's ear. Then there's the methodical selection of what we might call domesticated memes. Now, laying hens, many varieties of laying hens would go extinct if it weren't for their human owners, their keepers, who do the incubation because the broodiness has been bred out of them. They wouldn't reproduce in the wild. They'd go extinct. They depend on helping hand from their owners. And, of course, we have lots of memes that are like that, too. One that comes to mind is calculus. Or maybe here in Southern California you find that those second derivatives, you just can't get them out of your head. They're so catchy. You're just talking about them, thinking about them all the time. Is that right? No, I think not. The calculus memes have to be patiently bred and copied and rehearsed and replicated with a lot of attention and rehearsal. And every time you rehearse it, of course, you're making a descendant. Every time you say it, you make another copy in your mind. Every time you say it, you make another copy in your mind. Everybody? Every time you say it, you make another copy in your mind. You see? That's how it works. It sticks. And, of course, we add mimetic engineering. That is to say, deliberate attempts to design memes that will catch on and flourish. Sound bites, spin doctoring, advertising, and like some of it works, most of it doesn't. Now, we're ready to draw a conclusion or two. You know what bootstrapping is? It's picking yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's worked in the past and it can work again. I want to give a very simple example which can serve as a template for lots of others. How do you draw a straight line? It's very easy. You get a piece of paper and a pencil and a straight edge. You put the straight edge down, you go like that with the pencil, you've drawn a straight line, right? Okay. How do you make a straight edge? Well, you get a piece of metal and you put up against a straight edge and where'd you get that straight edge? From another straight edge, which you got from another straight edge, and back it goes, not 10,000 years, but thousands of years actually. And the technology of making straight edges is an interesting history. And it has gradually improved over. You started with no straight edges at all, and now we've got really good straight edges. There's a book about this that I found very interesting. And here's a circa 1955 straight edge, a box straight edge, and that's about as good as you could make back then. And the book goes into what's valuable and good about it. It has the thermal expansion coefficient is very low, and it's self-proving, and the shape is just right to prevent twist and so forth. It's very accurate. How accurate is it? Well, it's as good as this. This is a graph at 1,000,000 times vertical scale of the edge. It doesn't look very straight, does it, that line? That's what the straight edge looks at 1,000,000 times magnified. Look what we've got here. What we've got here is the ideal of a perfectly straight line, the form of the straight, as Plato might say, that was arrived at by approximation, both of the artifacts and of the idea itself. And the fact that we can represent the imperfection using some of our memes is itself one of those cranes that makes it better and better and better and better. I want to suggest that the form of the good, as Plato would say, has a similar history. What makes us human is then our brain children, even more than our genetic children. We and we alone, of all the planets, all the species on the planet, we represent our reasons. We can think about our values and our reasons. That is the source of our creativity. We, the reason representers, can now look back and discover the reasons everywhere in the tree of life. We can look back and we can discover all those free-floating rationales that were never represented before. It took Darwin to discover that a mindless process created all those reasons. We, intelligent designers that we are among the effects, not the cause, of all those purposes. Thank you very much for your attention.